Hey everybody, it's Pastor John and a whole group of guys here, Drew, Tom, and Derek. We're coming to you actually live from Chicago. How crazy is that? We took a quick trip after Sunday down here for a multi-site church conference, looking a little bit more deeply at what it looks like to multiply disciples and transform lives, how we can do that more effectively at Woodbury Lutheran. But what we want to discuss together tonight is some of the questions you guys texted in both on Sunday and on Saturday in connection with the Thy Kingdom Come series that we're going through. So guys, I'm just going to ask you questions, and whoever I start with, you can answer the question, but the other two of you guys who weren't directly asked it, feel free to chime in. So Derek, try not to tell anybody they're blatantly wrong right away.
Can we pass? I pass.
And so actually, we're going to get right to it. And so Tom, we're going to start with you. The first question that was texted in is, are you saying that the only way our country is going to change is if it becomes a Christian nation again? I know when you were in your sermon, you quoted that quote from John Adams talking about how our Constitution was written for a moral and religious people. And I think that's kind of where this question was coming from. Saying, hey, if our Constitution was written for moral and religious people, are we only going to change as a nation if we are more Christian and become more maybe moral or religious?
Yeah, it's a great question. We could spend the next probably 5 hours talking about it. First, I'd like to attack just the notion of being a Christian nation. I think when John Adams made that quote of talking about being moral and religious, it was a wider swath than just being Christians. And when you look at the founding fathers in the early part of our nation, it wasn't all Christian. In fact, there's all sorts of folks that fled here for religious freedom. I think the connecting point is the idea of being moral, and the way that he uses religious there speaks to, I think, the best parts of all religions. And when you look at all major world religions, there's good things about them in the way that we're supposed to treat one another and so forth. And so when Adams talks about being moral and religious, it's a wider swath than just being Christian. I think we bought into the lie in our nation that being moral is equivalent with being a Christian. I know these guys will have some thoughts on that, but following Jesus is about far more than just being moral. It's a part of it, but it's not the end-all, be-all. And I think maybe even you said this once, John, or it's one of the things we'll talk about this week in our message, that the idea of living as a disciple of Christ is not to make America a Christian nation, but it's to make America a nation that is full of Christians. And a nation that's full of Christians, right, is going to look far different than if somehow our goal is to make change only through government and influence only through government, when it actually is called to happen through us. So just to round back, I would say no, the answer isn't to make America a Christian nation again. It's to share Jesus with people so that their lives would be transformed by Him, which will then show itself in our culture.
Well, I would even hone in a little more on the word again. I don't know that we ever were a Christian nation. A nation full of a lot of Christians at different points in history, but our government never set out to be like an Islamic caliphate. It never set out to have the church be the dominating aspect, which is actually why a lot of the people who are free or coming from different places needed religious freedom from places that were forcing certain types of Christianity on them. And so I think that word again, it deceives us a little bit, because we never were officially a Christian nation, never have been. We've been a nation with a lot of people who were Christian, and as we see, that's waning in a different direction now.
Well, we see lots of change just culturally, and lots of you will track with me here, where 30 years ago it was going to church was just what you did. Even if you didn't really believe it just kind of was what you did, and if you didn't do that culturally, you weren't necessarily accepted. And so lots of people were going to church, but I don't know how much the church was coming back with them or living through them. And so I'll hear stories from folks that'll break my heart. I'll prepare for a funeral or something, and it'll be an older person, and I'll ask them about their faith, and then I'll say, well, They went to church a lot. They served on this board in the church, but they never talk about like what that faith meant for them as they came home and talked to their kids, or did it translate into praying together as a family or reading scripture together as a family. And often it did, not to say it never happened, but there's definitely a shift in the culture and what is kind of expected of people, where if you don't go to church today, nobody's going to say, look at you, you didn't go to church this weekend. It's almost a normal thing to do now.
Yeah, I think one of the things, even going back to the original, way it talks about religious morality, Tom, you were talking about that a little bit, there's a natural assumption that Christianity owns that. Right? So we start with, well, that's just us. So whenever we talk about those two things, I think about actually a person by the name of Ibu Patel, who's actually down in Chicago down here, who does some interfaith thing. He's a Muslim. And he tells a story about his grandma that harboring refugees in kind of the home country, and it's dangerous. If she would have been caught, she would have, there would have been some consequences for her, some pretty stiff consequences. And in the midst of that, he said the story, he kind of said to Grandma, why'd you do that? And she said, or that's what we do. That's Muslims, that's what we do. And I think a lot of Christians would look at that and go, oh, no, that's what we do. Because we're moral and we're religious. And so in that whole thing, coming back to what Adams is saying, and the way you were saying, Tom, too, is that's not a Christian health thing. That there's a deeper unity there that's outside of just Christianity.
Yeah, I think some of our listeners might struggle. I'm cutting you off. You're not going to get any words
Because they're good enough questions, then yeah.
But I think a lot of our listeners might be surprised to find that Christians, and take a group like the Muslim faith, have a lot more in common about social issues like sexuality and life issues. And we don't always think about that morality, like you said, isn't just owned by Christianity. That there are different religions where we actually pretty much line up with the same passions and zeals in those areas.
Yeah, to help one another. So for our country to function, we need everybody from every line of belief to be living in a certain direction to help and care for one another. Now, we have the hope of Christ that moves us to do that. Right? Often in these other faiths, it's we better live good enough so that God isn't mad at me, right? Or that I do enough to get back at God. So how much more joy is there in living knowing that why we do it, because of what Christ has done for us, instead of trying to get back to God. So we should be leading the way in this as followers of Christ.
Yeah. And even looking at, so someone texted in another question, and Derek, I'll let you take this one. It kind of springboards off of that, and maybe you would agree with what Tom just said, and kind of Christians are responsible for leading the charge and kind of moving into this morality in our country. But also, this person said, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. I agree with that. But are we still a moral and religious people in the United States? This probably isn't just talking just about Christians, but about the United States in general. But what do Christians do about that, and do you agree with that?
Well, I think that the hard part about that is when morality becomes the goal. Like, I think so many times we think that it's all about being moral. Mm-hmm. So like the most important thing, like for example, the most important thing for my kid is that they do the right thing, and that they don't drink, they don't have sex, they don't, whatever the moral is that we think that's really important, and that's important stuff, but we take that as the ultimate thing. And, Tom was saying that there's something that's far more deeper about that. I mean, the thing I want my kids to know is I want them to know Jesus, and that eternity is set for them because of their relationship with Jesus. For me, that's far more important than their morality. Now, not saying the morality is not important, but I think priority is really important within those two things.
And morality follows.
It follows. Yeah, absolutely.
The fruits of the Spirit come out of faith in Jesus Christ, Him crucified, as we saw in Galatians 5 this week from our scripture reading, that Christ crucified, we're crucified with Him in that, and no longer do we live to our own flesh, but now we live in the Spirit, and those are the fruit of the Spirit that we read Galatians 5 this week.
But I think, so in the fruit, that we got to make sure that the priority is right. So as the church, the thing that we've got to do is make sure that that's our lead. Not to recapture morality. Morality will follow if we concentrate on the thing that's the most important thing, which is the relationship. And so even in this election, as we're looking at that, how do we lead? How do we lead with priority? Having the heart for our neighbor and where they are. Do we? And I think a lot of times what I see in the conversations I'm having with people that are talking about people that disagree with them, their focus is on their behavior and the choices that they make. And then we're not even asking the question, what kind of relationship do you have with Jesus or with whomever?
Well, and I wonder too, just in this day and age, with these guys and Facebook and Twitter and the media the way it is, in our small group we were talking about past presidents, right? And JFK, what was going on in the White House when he was there. But there was an agreement, right, where the media kept that stuff kind of quiet and shoved it under the rug. So are we worse today than we were 200 years ago? I don't know. There's been some sort of a shift, I think that we all agree, in our culture when it comes to things that we've traditionally held as important and valuable. But there's been immorality all along the way.
Except the 1950s.
From 1950s to 1958.
Yeah. Should you hear that? I mean, that thought of, maybe we're just being more public about our immorality than we were.
And it's more accepted, definitely.
Right.
Right? Like, we don't want to tell anyone they're wrong in what they do. So maybe we kept it quiet because we were ashamed of it, because we knew it was wrong. I don't know.
Well, we're going to come back to that topic a little bit of how you love your neighbor as a Christian, as a disciple of Jesus in today's world. But we're going to switch gears a little bit. And Drew, I'm going to ask you this question just to make sure. You do watch news every now and then, don't you?
I do.
Sadly, but you do.
I probably read more news than I watch news.
There you go. All right. Well, so there was one person who texted in kind of concerned a little bit, saying, how can we really respond to the bias of U.S. news stations? Because we've heard that a lot this election. I'm sure you guys watching have heard that a lot as well. That all of our news stations are biased in some way, shape, or form. How do we respond to that as Christians?
Yes, they're biased. You're right. It's true. I think sometimes we got to step back a little bit first and ask why are we so concerned about what the news is feeding us and how it's feeding us. I think it's important to gauge that and to walk through that. But I also think it's important to recognize that we actually have a pretty good media system in the U.S. compared to most countries. We've just been dealing with Ethiopia this last couple weeks and some of the conflict that's been bubbling up over there. And right now, I don't want to say too much because we're live on the internet, but there are governments that squash media and communication. And in the U.S., we actually do a pretty fair job of being able to at least, whether there's a bias on one end or the other, at least we can be able to hear all the different biases and filter those out. And so I think it's crucial, it's critical for us today in our time and era to be able to step in and parse out what the media is giving us and pray for wisdom and direction in maybe what we hear and what are the things that are happening. But I think it's true, there is bias, but we do have the fortunate opportunity, if we put some effort into it, to be able to parse through that and try to figure out what is going on, which a lot of people around the world don't have that opportunity. They're spoon-fed what they're hearing.
Yeah. Any thoughts, you guys? Or
Yeah, I think we have an opportunity to learn too from each other. I know that I get set in my own ways and my own opinions, and I watch certain stations over others. But once in a while, I'll find myself moving to watch a different station to get just a different perspective. I think it gets real easy for us just to get locked into our own ideas.
The filter that you're talking
yeah,
about.
you talked about the filter this week.
Hold up that filter and just look through that and realize everybody has one, right? So every station is going to have a quote unquote bias. Yeah, you hear a lot about the left media today and why are they doing this and that kind of stuff. And then you hear the complaints on the other side as well that, Fox News reports it the wrong way or they put their own spin on it. But it says fair and balanced, so that should make it okay. So I think what Pastor Drew said, just being able to pray for wisdom through that and not letting it speak fear into our lives. I've talked to way too many people over these past few months that are reading stuff on the internet, watching videos that are being manufactured by people that are all just really fear-based and say, if this candidate gets elected, this is going to happen, or if this candidate gets elected, this is going to happen. And it's on both sides of the aisle, and I don't know what good that does because I don't have much control we have over that, and so maybe we should lean into Christ and His words. Do not be afraid.
Well, and here's the deal too. Throughout Christianity, for the last 2,000 years, most Christians have not been able to speak into their government and say that we think our society should be this way or that way. Most Christians have been at enmity with their government. And so we're in a really kind of unique place as Christians today to be able to somehow speak in or influence our government. But in some ways, it's maybe better when we start to look into the topic this week of our sermon. Maybe instead of getting the higher leg up in politics, the kingdom of this world, maybe we should kind of take the approach Jesus took, right? And then come under and serve and not come as he didn't come as a prince, but he came as one who was meek in his approach to life. And so I think we need to maybe step back and realize, okay, elections they're big deals, but it's not the end of the world if we don't get the right person in. And maybe it's actually better for the Christian church to see their hope in something more than just a kingdom of this world approach.
Yeah, and I'm going to springboard off of that. Sorry, we don't have all the time in the world, and I'll jump to Derek for this question. Actually, that way he can speak.
Excellent.
And this one will be, we don't have a hope in any one candidate, and so actually this question becomes really relevant. Someone texted this morning and said, as a conservative in Minnesota, showing their colors a little bit there, must I assume that my vote is a binary choice between the candidates most likely to win?
Yeah, actually, what's interesting about that is I've heard more commentary and dialogue about that in this election than probably any other election I can remember, of people going, well, even trying to figure out between two candidates that they don't necessarily like. And what do? Do you go for the candidate that you really think is right, or do you go for the one that's going to win? And another, I think, taking a step back, does our vote only count when our candidate wins? It does. So, for example, if the person I vote for is third, is my vote less valuable than the person that finished second or first? So I think the whole thing about voting is you gotta, at least for me, I've wrestled with this election in particular. I think at the end it comes to, God, where are you leading me? Even to talk about the Galatians yesterday with Paul's words, right? Of being in step with the Spirit, going, okay, how in this election are you leading me to vote? And being more concerned about that than I think if it counts or who's going to win or that. I want to be more in step with the Spirit than necessarily make sure that it's on the winning ticket or whatever that's going to look like. And I'm not sure that's the right answer, but I think that's where I'm at right now. And even if it's not those two candidates, or it's a third or fourth that's not going to win, right now, I mean, I'd vote for any of you three who's on the docket.
None of us are on the ballot for the state of Minnesota, just so you guys know. Yeah.
It's a hard question.
I'm not old enough, so it really doesn't matter. Yeah.
But I would say one of the things that I think has changed in my life from when I was earlier on is I used to go much more party affiliated. So that was just kind of the system I grew up with. And I think as I've kind of been challenged by some people actually that are probably on the other side of the ticket than I am, they've really said, and I think this is even going back to the last one, I think we need to challenge ourselves with some different viewpoints to make sure that we're not so locked into to a lane. And in the process, what I've really done is you start each time with looking at all the candidates and looking at all their views and all of where they're at. And I think it's bigger than any one particular issue or two or three particular issues, and trying to get the biggest scope, and then just saying, okay, Holy Spirit, in the midst of this. And in fact, I said this a little bit in the sermon yesterday. Maybe the question is, which one do I think is going to call or is going to have the best thought towards serving the neighbor? Thinking of other people besides themselves, and it's not just about me and what I've got, but maybe the best one that represents 40 different issues and serving other people.
Yeah, that's a big question, and maybe springboarding off of that one, Tom. Somebody texted in and said that's a powerful word to say, love your neighbor as yourself. I know you mentioned that in your sermon. But the person said, okay, so should this just include the people who worship with us or agree with us or are our physical neighbors? Or should it also include those who we disagree with? And the person went on to say, should it include people like Syrian refugees or rulers and citizens of Iran and Iraq and Pakistan? Should it include Muslims in the United States or other countries? Should it include people of Somalian descent in Minneapolis? Does it include those people, and what does that actually look like to love your neighbor in those situations?
So Jesus, pretty smart guy, had a young guy come up to him and say, well, what do I got to do to be saved? A lot of you know this story. He says, keep all the commandments. Well, I've done all that. He tells him to sell all his stuff. Remember, he goes away sad because his hope was in his stuff. And then another time, Jesus tells this great story about a neighbor. And again, we know this story, the Good Samaritan. And he asks the question, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And it was kind of that same thing. Is it just people that I know and love? Is it just my physical person who lives next to me, or is it somebody out there? Is it one of these kings or a refugee or someone that I might even consider an enemy? And that parable answers the question very clearly, that your neighbor is anyone who needs help. And the divide between the Samaritans and the Jews, at that time was so deep. We look at race relations in our country today and kind of how they've fallen apart. I don't know that could hold a candle to what was going on in Jesus' day between Jews and Samaritans and the hate they had for one another. And with this one story, he breaks down that wall. And so my answer to the question is, yes, all those people are your neighbor, and what do you do about it? You find the one that's in need, and you care for them, whether they're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or an atheist, a homosexual, someone struggling with gender identity, all these kind of things that have just blown up in our... You care for them, right? And then watch what happens as you care for them. Hearts are changed. I've seen this in my own life in conversations I've had with folks, and you guys have as well, with people who believe far differently than we do, and are even antagonistic toward our faith. But when they've seen me care for them and a relationship begin to develop, you can just see their hearts soften. So it's a great question. It's a very complicated answer in some ways, and in other ways it's pretty simple, right? I mean, we've got refugees all around us. We've got kids that we're serving at a school 3 miles from Valley Creek who are primarily Somali, and we're giving them food. These are tangible ways to reach out and to care for your neighbor. I could go on and on because it's an important kind of deal.
Yeah, sometimes I think we might tend to justify that, well, if we vote this way, that'll legislate taking care of others or the morality will help shape and curb others. But I truly believe that it is more powerful to live morally than to legislate morality. And what I mean by living morally, not just conjuring up a moral life, but living out of those fruits of the Spirit that we've been given in Christ. And so when we actually embody and live out what God designed us to live in, that's actually a testimony to those that are around us, to our neighbors. And when we just think that if we get the right candidate in or the right party in and we legislate it, we're missing the boat on what the early church did before Constantine. Their concern wasn't about how can we get up in the Roman Empire so that we can legislate things. Their concern was, how do we love a broken world? How do we care for people that think differently than us, that want to kill us, that want to take our freedom of worship away? And they realized that even if Rome says we can't worship and say Jesus is Lord, they were still going to worship because they knew that that couldn't be taken away from them, even if their lives were taken away. That they were going to follow Jesus and they were going to love their neighbors, which is why it was, by the time Constantine came along in 312, it was the fastest growing faith in the world. And I think it was because they loved, not because they were trying to get a foot up in the government.
Yeah, that's a powerful statement. So if you've been browsing on another window for the last 2 minutes or so, you're shopping on Amazon, come back and rewind it a couple minutes and just listen to what Pastor Drew said, keeping track with us here. Tom, we're going to go again to you with this one.
I'll be short this time.
Yeah, there you go. Someone texted in and said, laws are the threshold of legal and ethical behavior. How do we go beyond virtue, excellence, and morality? 3 things that you talked about in your sermon. How do we do these things beyond just inside the doors of Woodbury Lutheran Church?
Some of what I was just talking about, I think, in this last conversation, right? If you're at Oak Hill, you're getting involved in Valley Outreach, and you're getting involved in being connected into your community. You're going on mission trips. You're taking your next step in faith, same thing on the Valley Creek campus. I think it's really, when you look at those things not as requirements, but again as fruits that just naturally grow out of a walk with Jesus. I think it's really easy, again, when we look at even the fruit of the Spirit or morals or whatever, virtue, excellence, to put them up on a checklist of things that we have to do and we work toward, when we realize we're always falling short. But as we walk closer with Christ, those things begin to happen, and your eyes are open to opportunities, and you just naturally step into them. You see a neighbor in need, and you just do something, not because you're supposed to, or because that's what the virtuous thing is to do, but it's because who you are as someone defined by Christ, because He went far beyond, right, the minimum barrier of, He could have just said, I forgive you all, but He stepped into being a lowly servant. He lived the perfect life for us, was obedient to death. And so we always look to Him for our example, but more than that, for our strength, because after all, He lives in us by His Spirit.
Yeah, that's...
You almost wonder if we spend as much time thinking about, you think about how much time we spend about who we're going to vote for. Think about if we took that time to talk about it. What if we spend as much time on loving our neighbor and who that is and who on our block and the relationship that God has put into our lives to make a difference there. If we spend as much time on that and political ads and different debates going back and forth on where we can make a difference, I'll tell you that's far more impactful than I think anything that we can do on election night.
Yeah.
And not that that's not impactful. I think that's something that we're called to do as Christians and as people who are under this authority. But that's talking about right priority.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's keeping these two things in tension.
Yeah.
A little bit, right? We're not saying the political process and all that isn't important, but I think we overemphasize it. I think, like you just said, in a way that we forget the other side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When really the other side of it is where we make our money, so to speak, as followers of Christ, right? That's how we make a difference in people's lives.
Right.
Is over here. Not that this isn't important, but this is going to make lasting transformation.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to ask Drew. I'm just going to have you answer this question, unless you guys completely disagree with something he says. Yeah.
Probably will.
Get ready.
Yeah. And then Derek will go with you for our last wrap-up question. But Drew, someone texted this: how do we reconcile a regime like Assad's with what Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, maybe specifically in verse 13? The person texted and said, God knows that terrible rulers will exploit and suppress his children. So how do we reconcile those things?
Yeah, so the question is about Bashar al-Assad in Syria.
Doesn't live in North Carolina,
Doesn't-
right?
no,
For those
that's
of you that listen to
Kim
Pastor
Jong-il.
Drew's sermon, yeah.
I sometimes get excited that I say the wrong place. Kim Jong-un, just for the record, is not the leader of North Carolina. It's North Korea. It's the same question that the early church had. They had Nero and all sorts of emperors after him who spurned and even killed them to the point of actually helping the church to grow. And it's not something that we want to encounter. Suffering isn't something that you go looking for. But in my sermon, I talked about the theology of the cross. That's an idea that Martin Luther came up with when he looked at scriptures. He said, all of Scripture, when you look at Jesus' life, is dying with him in his crucifixion. And that means that suffering comes to our lives. And we're so concerned sometimes in our own political system about, when we think about voting, what's going to keep me safest? When that's not the question that the early church was struggling with. They were struggling with, how do we proclaim Jesus and him crucified? Which, if you talk to Christians from Syria today who are coming over, go out and find some in Minneapolis or St. Paul. They're in our city. Talk to them about what they're concerned about as Christians, as people who follow Jesus. It's not about their safety necessarily. It's probably more about Jesus and him being proclaimed. And so we don't want to see people being persecuted. We don't understand why God allows that to happen. That's something that as theologians we talk about. God has a hidden side. And we can't explain that as your pastors. We can't say, this is why God is taking blessing from this country and why he's giving it to this country. We don't believe that we can think and know that. But we trust that God in his divine wisdom knows what's happening in certain nations and societies and cities. And we just pray that he continues with his Holy Spirit to point people to Jesus, which he does over and over throughout the centuries.
One addition.
Had to jump on it. He was waiting over here for it. Yeah.
No, that was really, really good. The thing that I was going to add is just the amazing words of Paul and Peter both telling us to pray for our leaders.
And honor the emperor.
Peter says, talking about Nero, and you say, well, why would he do that? Just think about the people in the community that saw Christians honoring the emperor who was trying to take their lives. Just think about that for a minute and how that would have impacted their relationships with those people and the questions then that they would have asked them, like, how did I just hear you pray for Nero, the guy who killed your brother or whatever, or is going to hang you on a cross upside down and fill Rome with Christians on crosses like was happening at the time? And just to think about the impact that would have. When I think of it that way, it reframes like what's in my heart when I want to pray for specific leaders in our nation, and go, maybe I should be doing that, not so much because God needs me to, but because of the witness that gives to our neighbors.
That's good. That's another get off of Twitter moment and listen to what he says. Yeah. And so last question here, Derek, I'll leave this one for you. You did talk about even voting for someone that would help care for other people and care for the neighbor around us a little bit earlier. But this person said, yeah, great sermons this weekend, great reassurance in the sermons. But the only thing I wasn't clear with, I felt it was a little confusing to say that it's not necessarily the government's role to take care of people, yet to encourage us to vote for the person who will love our neighbor and take care of those who need our help. Other than taking care of the unborn, it seems like a lot of people should just be more encouraged to take care of themselves. How do you respond to something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question, good clarification. And I think the biggest thing is this. If we start thinking that it's the government's job to take care of everybody, that's not what the government's for. Does the government do that? Yeah, absolutely. Does it have programs to do that? Absolutely. But our call as Christians, our call to the church is to love our neighbors, to meet the needs of those around us, to help out the widow, to be with those who don't have resources. And we spend a lot of time figuring out what that's going to be in our own communities and in the world as we do missions. But I think we have to stop thinking, man, if I could just vote and get my person in, they'll make laws, they'll do things, and it's their job to do that. That's just not the call, the fruit that comes out of the Christian life as a disciple of Jesus. And so the biggest thing in that is I think we should be looking to to put people into positions of authority that have that kind of a heart, that can move things that way, that have power and authority. So I think there is something that's great about that, but not to rely wholly on that. We have more of a, in fact, we have a little bit, or I put a challenge out, that we have more of a difference to get out and to love our neighbor, like we were saying before, than our vote even. We can have a bigger impact on what we do Monday through Friday, Monday through Saturday, whatever the 7-day week is. We have more potential, I think, to make a difference that way. But that's on us as the church. And we have got to take that responsibility.
That's big. Yeah, well, thank you guys for a good discussion. A little bit more lengthy, but I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. Just always a reminder that you can always talk to us as your pastors. You can always grab us and ask us a question, shoot us an email. We'd be happy to respond to you. I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion time. If you have any remnant questions, or even when you come to church next weekend, remember you can text in any questions you have, 872-222-WLC1 or 9521 are those last 4 digits there. I hope you guys are having a great start off to your Monday, great start off to your week. Take care.